Tonight's tale, The Green Mist, comes from Short and Shivery, 45 chilling tales retold by Robert D. Souci. The Green Mist. In the old days, folks believed that spring came to the world when a green mist covered the land and set seeds to bursting, and made fields and trees and flowers grow again. Once there was a family more eager than the rest for the green mist to rise and put an end to winter. Their only daughter had grown sickly during the time of cold and snows. She had been the prettiest young woman in the village, but now she was so pale and thin and weak that she could not stand up on her own 2 feet without the help of her parents or one of her brothers. Everyone else was sure she would die soon enough, but she thought that if only she could live to see the spring again, she would live. "Oh, Mother," she would say over and over again, "if the green mist would only come, I'm sure it would make me strong and well, like the trees and the flowers and the corn in the fields." Her mother promised her that spring would come soon enough, and she'd grow strong and pretty as ever. But day after day the girl became weaker and more lifeless, like an early blooming flower when winter comes back after a false spring. Each morning they carried her bed to the doorway so she could watch for the first sign of spring. But the snows lingered and kept the seeds asleep, and the trees lifeless and leafless, and the fields and flower beds locked in its frosty grip. Finally, a voice hardly above a whisper, the girl said to her mother, "If the green mist doesn't come tomorrow, then I must die. The earth is calling me, and it will cover me soon enough. Oh, if I could only live as long as those cowslips that grow by the door each spring, I swear I'd be content." "Hush now, child, hush," her mother cautioned. "You don't know who might hear you say such a thing." The old women knew that there were always bogies around, wicked goblins who made mischief and grief for their human neighbors. No one was ever safe. People thought these evil creatures they couldn't see were always spying on them and waiting to play their wretched tricks. Even as the woman looked nervously around, she thought she heard thin, piping laughter on the icy breeze. And the sound of that merriment came from no one of flesh and bone and blood. But her worries were quickly forgotten. The next day the green mist rose like an ocean, the color of grass in the summer sunshine, and as sweet-smelling as the flowers in spring. It covered the countryside and roused the earth from its winter sleep. The girl, watching from the doorway, said, "Now I'll live." She sat in the sun and laughed with joy, and waved to her father and brothers as they worked in the nearby fields. She grew stronger and fairer every day that the sun shone. Sometimes she would stretch her arms up as if she lived by its warmth alone. But when a cloud hid the sun, she suddenly became pale and wispy as she had been during the long, dark winter nights. But there were more sunny days than not, and the cowslips bloomed by the kitchen door. Soon she was running about and laughing like her old self. Every morning she would kneel by the cowslips and water and tend them. Sometimes she would dance for them in the sunshine. Sometimes her mother would catch her just staring and staring at the fragrant yellow blossoms. Once, when the old woman leaned down to gather a bouquet of flowers, the girl cried out, "Oh, Mother, don't pick a single one!" "Why not?" her mother wondered. "They're pretty enough growing where they are, and I feel that if you plucked a single one, you'd pluck out a bit of my soul with each blossom." The woman was deeply troubled by these words and the fear that she heard in her daughter's voice. She remembered the girl's rash promise that she would be happy living just as long as the cowslips, and she recalled the thin, piping laughter that had followed the girl's words. Indeed, her child seemed to grow stranger and stronger as the cowslips flowered. Yet she also grew more beautiful and strong enough to do chores around the house or run errands in the village. One day, in town, she met a handsome young man who thought her the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. They talked a bit, and he asked if he could come and visit her. She smiled and nodded and told him where she lived. He came the next day, and they walked together for a long time, hand in hand. In the afternoon they sat under a tree near the kitchen door. Because the day was sunny and warm, the girl fell asleep. While she dreamed, the young man gathered up the cowslips from beside the kitchen door and wove these into a wreath, and gently he set it on her head, waking her up. At first she laughed, but when she pulled the wreath off her head to look at his handiwork, she was horrified to see what he had done. "You picked the cowslips to make this!" she cried. "Aye," he said, "a crown of flowers for the prettiest lass in the neighborhood." But with a moan she snatched up the wreath and clutched it to her chest. And then she stood staring wildly around at the green trees and sprouting grass and the golden sun and the yellow cowslips most of all. Puzzled, the young man reached for her, but she gave an awful cry like an animal in pain and hurried into the house, slamming the door behind her. Nor would she open it when the young man knocked and pleaded with her to tell him what was wrong with his love wreath. After a time he gave up calling to her and went sorrowfully back to town. In the late afternoon the girl's mother, who had been visiting a neighbor, found her lying on her bed, with the wreath of cowslips in her hand. The old woman put her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, and then she sat by her child and tried to make her comfortable. But all the day long the girl seemed to fade, nor could her mother coax a single word out of her. The following morning her family found her lying, dead and white and withered, like the shrunken yellow flowers in the wreath still clutched in her hand. While the old woman clung to her husband and wept, she heard thin, piping laughter through the open windows. And then she knew for a fact that the bogies had heard her daughter's wish. They had let her live as long as the cowslips, but had caused her to fade when the cowslips themselves had died.